Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Nope? There. Now I can. Now you can hear me on the mic? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me this afternoon. So, as mentioned, Corianne Nguyen. So I am with the Clean Fuels Alliance America. I've been with Clean Fuels for about a year now. And so I'm pretty new to the Alliance. But what I'm going to be talking about today, has a lot to do with my career, as mentioned, with the state of Oregon, where I stood up the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, which is the Oregon version of a California low carbon fuel standard. So I'm going to take a step back, actually, for today's presentation. I wasn't really sure how all the rest of the presentations were going to go this morning, and actually, it's the good part about going last is I get to pick on all the different people that came before me. And so I think some of it was covered, and so I'm just going to try and pull everything back together. And then if you have more questions, absolutely ask more questions and we can follow up after the presentation. So what I'm going to really start with is I use the term very generically, clean fuels. And what do I mean by clean fuels? You know, since we have both corn and soy here represented today, it is a really general term as far as fuels that can substitute for the petroleum fuels that are used largely in transportation, but is also can be used commercially or in residential heating and those kinds of things. A lot of these products are domestically produced and can act as direct substitutes. Generically, again, you have lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower tailpipe emissions, and just all around, it's just a better fuel and for what we can substitute into these, into these applications. So I'm going to talk about 4 of these fuels today. So I think we heard a lot earlier about ethanol, and ethanol is primarily used in passenger vehicles as a substitute and blending with gasoline. And then the next 3, biodiesel and renewable diesel, and then sustainable aviation fuel. So we talked a lot this morning with the Delta representative about SAF. But in biodiesel and renewable diesel, largely blended with fossil diesel into your heavy-duty vehicles. So your trucks, rail, marine applications, those are kind of the applications that we're talking about. So it's just these fuels that can be used in those vehicles, but they're made from different renewable feedstocks. So this is meant to be just a kind of like, again, a high-level overview about what kinds of things that we're talking about. So feedstocks, at the very top, I have sugarcane and corn. Sugarcane, just to include another feedstock that's not what we're talking about here with corn, but that is largely present in the ethanol space as well. So you can have corn going either from starch or fiber into ethanol. Excuse me. And then at the bottom, the soybean and canola are the crop-based feedstocks, and then also the waste-based feedstocks. So we're talking about used cooking oil and tallows and other kinds of fats and greases. And so the lipids, the oils, are the feedstocks primarily going into biodiesel and renewable diesel. But added on to that third kind of column is the secondary fuels, and that's where the SAF comes in. Because SAF can be made either from ethanols or it can be made from renewable diesels. It's just a technology that you add on. So when you look at this as a whole, you see multiple feedstocks with multiple different technologies to make all of these different fuels. And so as a previous speaker said today too, we're not talking about picking one feedstock or picking one technology or picking one fuel, right? It's all of the above to address all the different applications that we can have for these fuels. So why are we really talking about clean fuels? Primarily in clean fuels policy, it is a climate policy. So a lot of the West Coast states, California, Oregon, Washington, and most recently New Mexico, These are climate policies that are targeting to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. Transportation is typically the largest source of greenhouse gases as far as climate pollution, which is why low carbon fuel policies have been developed and implemented in those states. But also, I talked about the tailpipe pollution. So if you talk about, the exhaust from your truck or, from your rail, your locomotives or marine engines or whatnot, the pollution that actually comes out of that is largely carbon monoxide or fine particulate matter or nitrogen oxides. These are the things that affect your public health. So these clean fuels also reduce those emissions. And so by changing out the fuels to these cleaner fuels, you have less emissions and better public health outcomes. What's really interesting about climate policy these days is that it's looking at the entire supply chain of how you make the fuel. So from the farm to the crush, to the producers, to the end users, the fleets themselves. And because the policies actually look at all parts of the supply chain, there can be value throughout that supply chain as well. So because we look at emissions at the different parts of how that fuel is made, you can derive values out of each part of the value of the supply chain. And so the theory here is that, that the fleet can benefit from having lower fuel prices. Like on the West Coast, you can get renewable diesel for cheaper than ultra-low sulfur diesel, right? So the fleet is paying a lower price. You can have producers that are getting credits for producing a lower carbon fuel, or you can have the latest of the policies would be implementing climate-smart ag practices so that the farmers can actually benefit from some of these policies as well. So. And all of that rolls up into just multiple opportunities for how different parts of the supply chain can actually benefit from these. So this is a really busy slide, but what it is intended to show is that there are different kinds of policies that are out there that can encourage more and cleaner fuels. So I work on the state level policy team. Here at Clean Fuels, we also have a federal policy team. And so federal policy, federal renewable fuel standard, tax credits, those kinds of things. But at the state level, there's also a suite of policies as well. There are lots of states that actually have fleet requirements for their vehicles. I'm the state of Oregon, and I have my fleet, and my fleet must use B20 in the diesel vehicles, for example. So there's a lot of those states that have those kinds of mandates. Incentives, there are a lot of states, especially in the Midwest, that have incentives, tax credits or tax exemptions from blends of biodiesels and renewable diesels in their fuels. And so that's a way that you can bring down the cost of those fuels in using tax credits and whatnot. Infrastructure programs. So in as much as some of these fuels do need different infrastructure needs, different tanks, different pumps, adjustments to vehicles, there are grants and incentives that are focused at providing infrastructure to enable those kinds of blending. Mandates. There are certain states, several states that actually just say your diesel must be blended with certain percentage of biodiesel. So most notably Minnesota, Oregon, and I know there's one more. I can't read it. I can't even read the thing. Pennsylvania, that have these mandates. And so all of the fuel sold in, all the diesel that's sold in those states have like a mandatory biodiesel or renewable diesel component. Also, even at lower levels, I live in the state of Oregon, and the city of Portland has its own mandate as well. So of all the diesel that is provided in the city of Portland right now, it is mandated increasing amounts of biodiesel or renewable diesel, going from 15% to 50% to 99% in the next 5 years. So it's another way to to mandate that. The last one, clean fuel standards. So this is what normally I would call a low carbon fuel standard. And most of you, or maybe you don't know, but the biggest of the low carbon fuel standards is the state of California. And that has been a program that has been in implementation since 2010. I'm not going to go into all the gory details that make up a low carbon fuel standards, but the general gist of it is that if you have a carbon score, like all the emissions that you count for a fuel, like I said, from the way that the feedstock is grown all the way through the combustion in a vehicle, and you have carbon scores. So that means every single fuel, so it's a biodiesel, renewable diesels, electricity, ethanol, hydrogen, propane, natural gas, all the different fuels, everything has a different score depending on what it's made from, how it's made, and how it gets transported into the state of California. And you count that up, and basically what you're trying to do is incent the transition from the fossil fuels to something else. So they have a higher score because they're higher in carbon, and then every year you basically lower the levels that are mandated for the state. So something like a soy biodiesel is actually about 50% cleaner than what a petroleum-based diesel is, right? And so it's a credit system, so the lower the carbon score, the more credits you generate. And you can sell those credits to providers of fossil diesel. So the oil companies are the market that those credits are based on, excuse me, are valuable in. You sell the credits, you get the revenue, and that's what that incentive is. So this is not a system where a government is actually giving you cash, but it is the market of the higher carbon and then the lower carbon fuels that are basically being traded. California started this program back in 2010, Oregon started in 2016, Washington started in 2023. And the next state that will be implementing is New Mexico, maybe 2025, later 2025, maybe 2026. So they're in the process of writing rules now. And this is a policy that has become very popular. I think the metric that is most notable from California is if you go to California now and the diesel, 75% of the diesel fuel in California is biodiesel or renewable diesel. So 75%, right? So that is the market. Like 50% of the renewable diesel and biodiesel made in the United States ends up in the California market. And so what I try to do as part of my job is to get other states to have these policies. So most notably Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Colorado, Hawaii. Those are kind of the states that are in conversation about having these policies. And it's a way to open up the markets, right? We talked earlier this morning about even just in the SAF space, right? Billions of gallons of market where these fuels can still expand. And that is a primary role that we play for Clean Fuels Alliance America right now. This is a map that just shows you, it's a jumble of different colors. And all the different colors basically represent one of the different kinds of policy incentives that I just talked about, right? So they're all over the country. I think the thing what you noted here are the states that don't have any kind of color, right? They're pretty few and far between. So there's lots of conversations in all of the states in different, across the country about what makes sense for their state. Does a blending mandate make sense, right? Or is an incentive make more sense? Or do you want to set up a whole market-based system like a low carbon fuel standard? And so the state team at Clean Fuels, we participate in all of these different states on different levels. New legislative bills, new incentives, those kinds of things. And I think, as I mentioned before too, the reason, so it's those states that have these programs, you can see real big differences in the penetration rates of biodiesel and renewable diesel. So like that chart on the left, that total blue wedge is the amount of biodiesel and renewable diesel that is being produced this year, 2024 numbers. And that green wedge underneath, that green wedge itself is California, right? So that's 50% of the fuel that's going to those markets. On the right-hand side, that's the penetration rate. So in California, like I mentioned, 75%. In Oregon, it's about 35%. In Washington, it's 20%, right? So nationwide, I think the average is about 10% of the total amount of diesel fuel being renewable. And there's a lot of places in the country that don't have access to these fuels at all. So there's a lot of room for growth. And I think that's where I will stop off. Turn it over to Kent.
Thank you. Thanks, Corianne. Good afternoon, everyone. Kent Hartwig with Gevo. I want to start off by answering the question that's probably running through all of your heads right now. What is up with this dude's hair? So, during COVID, no access to a barber, my hair started growing out, and my wife really started to like it. And so, after a while, it's kind of become my trademark, so I'm stuck with this haircut. So, anyway, just wanted to let you know about that. So Gevo is a publicly traded company. This is a safe harbor statement. Anything that I say here today shouldn't be a forward-looking statement, but go ahead and not trade our stock based on this conversation today. So Gevo is a renewable fuels and chemicals company. We've been around for about 15 years now. Our focus currently is on the commercialization of sustainable aviation fuel, specifically from ethanol to jet fuel. And so we've got a whole portfolio of locations across the country. Our headquarters is in Colorado. It's basically a lab and where our C-suite is. I'm actually based in Des Moines, and we've really used remote work environments to have a large nationwide group of folks that run our company. We've got an old brine facility that's located in Laverne, Minnesota. We use that as a demonstration plant where we bring in the customers of our customer, essentially. So Delta will fly in folks from, the folks, they're flying around all over the country, and we really get an opportunity to explain rural ag and ethanol to folks that have never been to what they consider flyover country. So it's really an exciting part of my job is to have that conversation with folks like Susan G. Komen or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Michelin Tires about what ag's all about. So anyway, we've used that to grow to build our ethanol and our isobutanol, and then we would send that down to Silsbee, Texas, where we would turn it into sustainable aviation fuel. We're working on pairing those two technologies with a greenfield location in Lake Preston, South Dakota. It'll be an ethanol plant and a hydrocarbon plant where we'll make the sustainable aviation fuel. We also have a renewable natural gas plant in northwest Iowa, 3 dairies where we take the methane and bring it to a centralized location, clean it up, and then inject it into the pipeline and use that in those West Coast carbon programs for transportation fuel. And then I'll get into this a little bit more, but Verity is an application, a farmer-based application, where we're able to take the inputs from folks that are in our grower program, understand the ag practices that they're doing, and then provide them with a carbon intensity score for their crop, and we're paying them a premium for their corn at this point. Now, yesterday, and the reason that I'm super excited to be here in North Dakota is that Gevo has completed a purchase of an ethanol plant here in North Dakota, and that was announced yesterday. And so we have begun our process of having the lowest carbon intense ethanol in the country out of Richardton, North Dakota. And so there's a carbon capture sequestration well on site, along with a really exceptional ethanol plant. So that's our footprint. So why are we involved in sustainable aviation fuel, and why do you all care? Well, the reason is that there's no meaningful reduction in the carbon intensity of the aviation industry without sustainable aviation fuel. We're not going to see an electric plane anytime soon. And if you were here this morning to hear Jeff Davidman, he said the same thing. But this is the FAA's assessment of when they think that there's going to be battery electric planes. And for medium and long haul flights, it's not really within my working career, out to 2050. And so we have a massive opportunity with a large amount of fuel to be successful. So guess what, folks? The next ethanol, it's ethanol. We can take an existing product and turn it into the next future renewable fuel, and you all are going to be able to participate in it. The market is massive, 130 billion gallons of global demand, and we have access to 50% of that fuel tank. We have ASTM spec where we can blend up to 50%. Now let's be realistic, let's say 30%. That's 39 billion gallons on an annual basis of market from a global perspective. Delta itself is 4 billion gallons. So when you look at what we've got for ethanol currently, we have an exponential opportunity. And so hopefully we can all get behind building this next market. So I use these next couple slides both from an agricultural standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. So we get pushback from the environmental community. You're just going to be growing more corn. You're going to be, doing all the things that environmentalists like to get on farmers about. Well, we're seeing a decline in ethanol usage, right? We're seeing fuel economy standards that are improving. We're seeing some penetration in electric vehicles. And so as ethanol demand declines, sustainable aviation fuel has the ability to come in and meet that market, to keep the corn grind at its status quo or maybe grow it. We had someone previously talking about ending stocks. Farmers are fantastic at growing corn. We're seeing 1.9 bushels an acre increase year over year over year. And so what are we going to do with that corn? We're seeing ending stocks continue to be growing. This chart says about 2.5 billion bushels of ending stocks on an annual basis. I heard it was reduced to about 1.5 billion as the previous speaker. But what are we going to do with that corn? Well, that's a great outlet for our industry in turning ethanol into jet fuel. So what do? We make ethanol, and those are shorter carbon chains. So when you think of a diesel molecule or a jet molecule, those are longer carbon chains. So ethanol's two carbons. We take that ethanol molecule, we dehydrate it, and then we run it through a catalytic reactors a couple times, take those C2s and turn them into C4s, and those C4s into C12s. There's a saturated bond there, so we need hydrogen to knock that off, and now it's a hydrocarbon. Now it's molecularly identical to jet fuel. It's seamless. We don't need to retrofit the fueling systems. We don't need to retrofit the jet engine. It can go in up to a 50% blend. And so at that point, no reaction is perfect, so we'll have some C12s that we're optimized for, some shorter carbon chains that are naphthas, longer carbon chains that are renewable diesel, sell those all into the fuel markets. So this is a straw man of what is the potential for a plant here at the Richardson site, right? So we purchased a facility that makes ethanol. That'll be an excellent feedstock for a sustainable aviation fuel plant located there on site. This is our facility that's in Lake Preston, South Dakota, that we'll be building hopefully very soon. It's a 65 million gallon facility, and so it'll use about 38 million bushels of corn on an annual basis. It'll utilize renewable hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and renewable electricity to lower the carbon intensity score. And essentially, like I said, it's an ethanol plant and a hydrocarbon plant. Some of the co-benefits, we talk about the emissions profile generally of fuel from a carbon standpoint, but as we look at communities that are impacted by air travel, these are generally underserved communities. They're challenged. And so if you continue to have jet airlines fly in and out, you're getting bombarded with particulate matter, you're getting bombarded with sulfur, you're getting really nasty chemicals. Our fuel doesn't have any of that. So we see significant reductions in aromatic pollution, sulfur, because we don't have any sulfur, and then ultrafine and regular particulate matter is almost zero, all with the same energy density or more. So these planes don't lose fuel economy by using our fuel, and they still have the reductions in the particulate matters. Okay, so to wrap up here, I wanted to talk about how and why we're using renewable electricity, renewable hydrogen, and the like, and then how it impacts you as farmers. So as you can see, and as Corianne mentioned, we measure our fuel based on a petroleum equivalent. And so jet fuel is a 90 out of 100. So it's a little better than the worst fuel. But when you take our fuel, the processes, the farming, the transportation, all of that goes into making an alcohol to jet, we could potentially be more carbon intense than jet fuel. And so in order to mitigate that, we bring in other mechanisms. So we engineer our plant to be focused on using as little energy as possible. And the energy that it does use, we'll be building a 100 megawatt wind farm at our Lake Preston site. And that power will be directly connected to the plant. It'll run an a hydrogen electrolyzer to make the hydrogen, so we'll have renewable hydrogen as an input in our fuel. And then we have the potential for the thermal needs to use that renewable natural gas that we have produced in northwest Iowa. All of those things get us to a point where we're in the ballpark for the 45Z tax credit. We have to have a 50% reduction compared to petroleum jet fuel in order to qualify for that tax credit. And so that gets us there, but we got to run the plant perfectly. It's really challenging on turnarounds. We got to change those catalysts every once in a while. So we want to have a little bit of a buffer, and that's where carbon capture and sequestration comes in. So capturing that CO2 that comes off the fermenter, you feed yeast the carbohydrate in the ethanol process that excretes alcohol and makes CO2. So capturing that biogenic CO2, permanently sequestering it, that really gets us within the ballpark to be able to operate within the margins of the plant. So we will be partnering with Summit Carbon Solutions in our South Dakota facility. And what's great about the Richardson site is that it already has that sequestration available on site. Where you all come in is on the carbon attributes of the feedstock. And so we plan to work with the farmers around the Lake Preston site on the ag practices that they're currently utilizing. And if the carbon intensity score of their feedstock is lower than the default value, we will pay them a premium for that fuel because we will be able to monetize and work with the farmer on monetizing the carbon attributes of the feedstock. And that leads us to a system that we have, and our team is here on site. If you have any questions, Carla's here with Verity. This is an app-based program where we're capturing that data, putting it into a system that can then be utilized by regulators with immutable, so it can't be modified, it can be audited. Regulators can feel confidence in these scores. And then, as programs have resources available to them, like the 45Z program, we'll be able to verify the carbon attributes that are coming into our process. So, wanted to save some time for questions, but super happy to be here, and thanks for your attention and hanging in there till the end.
All right. Well, we'll take some questions now, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation. We've got, 10, 15 minutes here where we can answer some questions and go through, have some conversations. I think I want to start with really I don't want to call the elephant in the room, right? The biggest question is, new administration, new direction, does that change anything from your perspective of the direction of this fuel and the opportunity that exists for the farmers in the room?
Not at all.
Okay.
So I've been in the industry long enough to know to start off with RFS, right? Back in the 90s or early 2000s, we were domestic energy production. That was the purpose of the RFS, right? And it transitioned to rural economies and value-added agriculture, and then it started to go into this carbon essence. And guess what? Now we're back to domestic energy production. And that is the basis of what the president is saying is we have an energy emergency, and ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, all of that plays into domestic energy production. North Dakota can absolutely participate in that. And so as you see these executive orders roll out, biofuels are explicitly called out in his executive orders stating we're a part of the solution. And so as we move forward, we have the full confidence that the president will be supportive.
Yeah. Corianne, you feel the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you heard it earlier today too. You know, it is part of the energy system and domestic. We are net, you know, exporters of energy right now, and I think there's just more potential for that.
So much potential. This is a great topic and a really good conversation I mean, you saw some of the slides earlier talking about demand and the competition that we have globally for our products, but this is homegrown demand, right? Where we're flying, we're driving, we're using this fuel anyway. This is a real opportunity for farmers to participate in that. So on that side, talk a little bit about some of the work being done on the carbon intensity score side of things for U.S. corn and soybean farmers, and how do they make sure they remain a feedstock for these, you know, low carbon fuel systems?
Yeah, you want me to go first?
Sure.
I'll try. You know, this speaks to a lot of the work that we're doing with the soy farmers. I referenced the California program because that is the biggest market that we work in. But when you count that carbon score, there's different parts of it where it talks about like, you know, the land that you actually farm on. And that is a high point of controversy for the state of California. There is a value in there for land use change, and it is based on 2004 data. It's old, and it's one of those things where we've got better data for 2014, 2017. I mean, just, you know, work that we've done with the soybean complex to get better data for that. It makes a difference. So like when we talk about carbon scores in California, what the number they're using is 29. And the number in the studies that we've supported say that the number should be 10.
Oh, wow.
Or 12, right? And so if you can imagine your score going from, say, for example, 50, right? I think I referenced it earlier, but going down to 30, right? Instead, that much more credit generation, that much more value to the product. And that's something that, you know, is an ongoing conversation with the state of California. But when we do work in other states and other states that want to set up a program like this, especially in the Midwest states, I think have a much better position with the farmers and the feedstock, and just much more amenable to kind of have that conversation about using the best science provided by the farmers to be able to have those values, you know, kind of reflected in it. And so that is a lot of focus that we have right now.
Yeah, ILUC is certainly a problem. Indirect land use change, it's a phantom number that isn't really something that is science-based. I mean, the original ones. We're building models that identify a better alternative to that. But I think what we're seeing now and the excitement that we have with the 45Z program is that farmers are going to be a part of the ability to decarbonize the fuels that we produce. So the 40B guidance, and I know I'm getting jargony here, but it's kind of an interim program that was there for a year. We got some guidance, and nobody's ever going to be able to use it. Well, the good thing is that they put into that guidance that there was ag practices that could qualify. But what we got with 45Z was a significant improvement, decoupled the practices, added new practices, was really pretty farmer friendly. And so as we build out the system to quantify and then provide resources to farmers for doing these practices, we have a robust system. And so GEVO with the Verity system is building that network. And unfortunately, we're pairing the process of building the system with a policy that's just getting off the ground. So we're kind of doing both, building the plane while it's taking off, essentially.
Sure, that makes sense.
Well, and additionally on the state level too, right? It's harmonization of the policies that really then make difference, right? It doesn't make sense if a state policy is different than what the federal policy is. So harmonizing all of those aspects is really kind of like a, you know, focus as well.
So hopefully we'll get some more answers in the next few months, weeks, you know, this year as the new administration comes in, kind of sets more of the ground rules then going forward.
Yeah, and it clearly is the prerogative of the new administration.
Okay. What I think this kind of goes to that, but the follow-up question here is, how do farmers get compensated for meeting some of these sustainability demands driven by stakeholders and consumers?
Mm-hmm. So our process, we would work directly with the farmer, identify the ag practices, build it into their system, and then you know, they would be compensated directly. I'm not intimately familiar with the process. We also have worked with some ag retail organizations to work with farmers as well. Ideally, we're seeing it as a direct connection to the finished fuel, but there's going to be opportunities where it's much beyond that, where those carbon attributes are going to be a part of a system that will be able to pay and not have that marketability to a ethanol plant or a soy crush.
Same.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think you see around here too. I mean, you're familiar with other different programs that, will pay you a premium if you follow certain ag practices, whether it's for certifications, maybe for a European market or, what have you, is that I think it's a similar system where, they'll, a checklist of practices, and if you do those certain things, then a premium will be reflected by that.
This one's for you, Corianne. What changes are happening in rail and marine with biofuel use?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So
We've talked a lot of aviation.
We've talked a lot of aviation, and I think that the core of the heavy-duty vehicles, right? So the on-road semi-truck and those that fuels. But more recently, a really encouraging work that we're doing with the rail system. All 6 of the Class 1 railroads are now members of Clean Fuels Alliance America, and would basically have commitments to use higher blends of biodiesel and renewable diesel in their locomotives. So working with the locomotive engine manufacturers to be able to use those fuels in higher and higher blends, and so that is ongoing work. Similarly in marine is kind of like where the latest of our work is happening now. So getting into the ocean-going vessels, again, I think recognizing that decarbonization of marine vessels, you're not going to have huge ocean-going vessels that are going to be electrified anytime soon. I mean, I think there's some talk about hydrogen or methanol or ammonia or those kinds of other fuels, but again, in biodiesel and renewable diesel, we have a product now that can be used in those applications. And so trying to get even, whether it's ocean-going vessels or hovercraft, ferries, those kinds of thing, barges, is something we're trying to increase access in as well. Yeah.
Can we produce enough feedstocks to satisfy, this is a big question, but can we produce enough feedstocks to satisfy demand? I mean, if we start to convert a lot of this, obviously, we've got more and more plants coming online, we've got more production coming online. How big does this get? Is there a limit that we've started to pencil in, or do we know?
I'm not concerned about it.
Okay.
The graphs that I showed, people start getting worried about food versus fuel and how are we going to divert, ag products from consumption of humans. We have the ability to grow more and more, and we're continuing to see that, 2 bushels a year. We have excess corn right now. Maybe someday there could be a top end of it, but I don't see it in the near future.
Yeah, I would say, I'm very bullish on that as well, because there's so many different feedstocks that can play into there. So, we talk here a lot about corn and soy, canola, cover crops, yet to be discovered kinds of things. I mean, even something like renewable diesel didn't exist 10 years ago, and now there's 5 billion gallons of it, and I think there will be technology, and there will be feedstock technology as well that can serve that.
And our process is taking well-known technology, right? We've made alcohols for millennia. We've got a significant amount of refining experience to take alcohols and turn them into hydrocarbons. That's relatively an easy process. But as you start to look at the DG Fuels of the world or other cellulosic companies, that's taking a waste product of what we're trying to do and turning it into a renewable fuel as well. So also an agricultural product. All of these things play into it, and I think once demand's there, I think we'll be able to expand on, let's walk before we run, but we'll run eventually, and that's where cellulosic comes in.
How much are you, on the West Coast, as you work out that direction, are you having to answer questions about fuel versus food, having that rear its head again as we start this kind of new kind of opportunity and demand for our crops and and those things. What's that conversation been like, and how can farmers help?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. You kind of refer to the West Coast, and California is kind of California, and there is a lot of really tough conversations because the market is so big and the fuel demand is so large that I don't blame the questions about coming up about food versus fuel or deforestation in the Amazon or, those kinds of questions because especially we talk about 6 billion gallons of fuel right now. That's a lot of fuel. And so, but I think there's a lot of good common sense and logic involved as well. I think there's a lot of good science that is available and information because when I can go to different states and say, but look, the acreage domestically has not expanded, right? The yields have increased. I mean, just the efficiencies of the crop are just so much better than it was before, right? Yeah. I mean, taking waste, something that we threw away before, and now utilizing it as a feedstock, I think all of those are very compelling arguments as well. So again, the people that are open to the logic and the common sense and willing to see that the innovation can occur, I think there's still a lot of positive there.
There's a huge disconnect between people and their food today. I do have a lot of conversations with folks on the coast, and they don't understand they don't know the difference between sweet corn and number 2 dent, right? They don't understand that it's two different corn, two different types of corn. They don't understand that number 2 dent really isn't food, right? It's the food for our food, and so we need to probably do a better job of educating people on. And we know it's simple, right? It's basic knowledge in the Midwest, but I think there needs to be an educational campaign on that, and specifically with ethanol, knowing that the byproduct of the process is of high protein, excellent feed for cattle or for livestock, and so we're not taking food away from our food. And so, one, you got to know that it's food for our food, and two, you got to know that we're not taking it away from our food. So,
yeah, good. One of the things we've heard and has been in the news quite a bit is the increase in imports in used cooking oil. How do you think that changes? I mean, obviously, somebody saw there was demand and moved to fill that demand by shipping that here. How do you think that whole conversation changes in the year ahead?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different pieces. I'll start with one, right? It's the fact that a lot of people think that this imported used cooking oil is not even used cooking oil, right? That it is virgin palm oil from Southeast Asia that maybe somebody dipped a French fry into, right? Right. And I think there are definitely efforts ongoing that are trying to get to that. And the suppliers of the used cooking oil are subject to some pretty what's the word, onerous requirements as far as traceability and tracking back to the point of collection, right? So again, it's on the supply chain documentation, attestations that it is what it is, and that it's not what it's what's fake either. And so, like for something like that, or development of test methods to actually be able to know whether it's used cooking oil or virgin cooking oil, those kinds of things. So I think that will actually a lot of work is being done on that now.
Yeah, so that's mainly a biodiesel, right, renewable diesel conundrum. Our process will create some corn oil that will sell into that market. So there's some concern there about flooding in the marketplace and how much value do we get from our distillers' corn oil. But generally, it's not an ethanol to jet issue.
Mm-hmm. How much more investment do we think we can see in this space? I mean, we've seen I'm going to say a boatload of investment in the last 5 years, right? Billions of gallons of capacity that is scheduled to come online. How much more investment is out there and opportunity, do we think? I mean, is it X meets Y, we're going to hit this, whatever the jet demand is, and that's what it is, or is there an upper limit on this?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's significant. Okay. It's billions and billions of dollars. So the plant that we intend to build in Lake Preston is going to be north of $2 billion. Will we find ways of maximizing efficiencies and things along those lines? This is really one of the first plants to be built. So, of course, it's going to be, on the higher end. We'll get more efficient as things go on. We'll probably see investments from the petroleum industry, right? They're going to get involved. So I do think it's significant. Putting a dollar figure on it, I'd be pressed. I'd be pressed.
Yeah, I don't know if there's an upper limit there, but I think what you're going to be seeing too is, like, again, trying to get efficient with the money that is around for investment. Like Kent mentioned, the oil companies. I mean, it's the refineries, the petroleum refineries now of the past that are converting to renewable diesel now, which will be the same facilities that will be converting to sustainable aviation at some time.
Okay.
Right? So it's kind of like playing the market and looking at the demand for the product, making investments on, big greenfield projects in addition to modifications of some existing infrastructure. So, I put a lot of money too.
Good. Last question. How excited are you about the next 5 years?
I am very excited about the next 5 years. One of the reasons why I transitioned over from being a regulator to being in clean fuels space right now is because it is the ripest time for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and SAF. There are so many benefits for that, for those fuels, and I think it's transformative for the transportation sector. And I think the next 5 years are going to be critical in that.
Yeah, it is an incredibly exciting time to be a part of the renewable fuels industry, specifically on sustainable aviation fuel. We're building plants, we're creating systems that are going to benefit farmers. As somebody that's involved in agriculture, I get to grow an industry, and I get to be a part of continuing to make farmers profitable. And that's what really drives me. So I'm super excited.
Really good. All right, well, let's give them a round of applause and tell them thank you for being here. And they'll be around for a little while longer if you have any questions, want to join up with them.